Welcome to another Roadway Wiz webinar presentation. Today we're going to take a look at the city of Mobile, Alabama and the Alabama Gulf Coast region. Quite an interesting area of the country, and there are quite a few things to talk about here, so glad you're with us. Let's get right into it. So Mobile is the fourth largest city in Alabama, behind Birmingham, Montgomery, and Huntsville. Roughly 200,000 people per the 2020 census. The MSA population is over 400,000. That is about the third largest in the state of Alabama. It's Alabama's only deep water port, and it's their gateway to the Gulf of Mexico and the ocean beyond. So economically, the Port of Mobile is vital to the economy of the state of Alabama and the Gulf Coast region as a whole. The city of Mobile was founded in 1702 as the first capital of French Louisiana. Keep in mind that this was 16 years prior to the establishment of New Orleans on the Mississippi River. Mobile and coastal Alabama became a part of the United States in 1813 with the annexation of West Florida from the Kingdom of Spain. The region is also rich in Civil War history. The single most famous engagement of the conflict in the Mobile area was the Battle of Mobile Bay, fought between the Union and Confederate naval fleets out in the bay near Fort Gaines. On August 5, 1864, Union Admiral David Farragut led a group of 18 ships into Mobile Bay across from Fort Gaines in an effort to seize and engage the Confederate fleet and seize the vital Gulf Coast waterway. When the lead vessel hit a mine and sank and the other ships hesitated, Farragut shouted, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." The Union fleet went on to shell the rebel fleet and their forts into submission in a decisive victory. That catchphrase from Farragut is quite famous in U.S. naval history. After the Civil War, Mobile became known as the city that revived the Mardi Gras celebration and hosted the first modern Mardi Gras in 1866. Of course, we think of New Orleans as being the capital of Mardi Gras, and it is. New Orleans does Mardi Gras better than anyone else. They might do it best. Mobile did it first, however, at least in the United States, and so we ought to take a moment to acknowledge that little quirk of history. I mentioned the Battle of Mobile Bay a moment ago. Fort Gaines is open to the public on the west shore of Mobile Bay, down on, I guess this is across from Dauphin Island. So if you want to make the trip all the way down there, that's a spot that's worth checking out if you're a Civil War buff like I am. Also in Mobile is the USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park. Now, the USS Alabama is a South Dakota-class battleship commissioned in 1942. It saw duty in World War II in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. It was stricken from the record post-war. It did not see active duty after that. It's been a museum ship in Mobile Bay since 1964. So you can go and see that if you'd like. By the way, her sister ship, the USS Massachusetts, is also a museum ship. She is currently located in Fall River, Massachusetts. So if the South Dakota-class battleship is something that interests you, these are a couple that you might want to check out. I mentioned the connection to New Orleans with the initial French settlement in the early 1700s, and then the connection that the city of Mobile has to Mardi Gras. Architecturally, the two cities are very similar as well. I like to think of Mobile as a miniature New Orleans in that you have a lot of similarities in the architecture. You can see in this picture in the lower left, this is the old city here. There are buildings complete with balconies and galleries, just like you would find in older sections of New Orleans. The oak trees that line the streets and avenues are also they're also a signature touch of cities down this way and on the Gulf Coast. So there's a lot that reminds me of a city like New Orleans and a city like Mobile. And it makes it one of my favorite cities in the South, to be honest. And the modern architecture is nothing to overlook either. The tallest building in the state of Alabama is located in Mobile. This is the RSA Battle House Tower. Completed in 2007, it has a roof height of 670 feet. The building gets its name from the historic Battle House Hotel, which is located down the street, or actually across the street from where the tower is located. Okay, so let's take a look at the region as a whole. So you have the city of Mobile and Mobile Bay are central to the area that we're focusing on tonight. Interstate 10 runs across this region from west to east, from Mississippi's Gulf Coast over to the Florida Panhandle. I65, which begins its journey up near Chicago, Illinois, ends its journey here in Mobile. There's also the I-165 spur, and there's a couple other crossings of the Mobile River, the Bankhead Tunnel and the Africatown Bridge. Both of those will feature in tonight's presentation as well. If we take a closer look into downtown Mobile, you can see how the interstates interact with the central business district, which is right in this area, right in the middle of the screen. 165 comes to an end at the north edge of downtown. It was planned to go further than that, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I-10 goes across the Mobile River through the George Wallace Tunnels and then emerges on the east side of Mobile on the Bayway, which we'll talk about as well. And there's also the Bankhead Tunnel, which was the original crossing of the Mobile River, which carries US 98 traffic as well. You can see that as well on this map. So that's an overview of what we have to discuss tonight. So let's jump in and let's talk first about really the main interstate in Mobile, which is I-10. As I said, it runs that course along the Gulf Coast. At this point in its transcontinental journey, it's emerging from the Florida Panhandle to the east and crossing into Mississippi and Louisiana to the west. One of the main streets, the main thoroughfares of the Gulf South, I would say. You know, you can apply this label to a few different highways. Perhaps US 90 fits this category better as being a main commercial strip for a lot of the cities on the Gulf Coast. But as far as interstate commerce is concerned, that honor really goes to I-10. At the Mobile River, the interstate crosses underneath through the George Wallace Tunnel. The tunnel features twin tubes, each carrying 2 lanes of traffic. It's built in the style of an immersed tunnel, which means that it's made from prefabricated sections that are assembled off-site and then floated and sunk into position in a pre-dredged channel. The tunnel sections are then joined from the inside, and the tunnel can then be used afterwards. A pretty straightforward interstate west of town, as you can see by the photos. Not a whole lot going on. The interchange with I-65 is out this way. So here's the tunnel you can see on the upper left. Again, you have twin bores. 2 lanes but no shoulders. The tunnels are a frequent traffic bottleneck point along the interstate. Okay, so here's a schematic of what an immersed tunnel looks like. And this is a similar layout to how the Wallace Tunnels in Mobile were built. And the Bankhead Tunnel as well was built using the immersed method as well. But we'll focus on this for now. So you can see how the existing seabed is dredged to make a channel. There's fill that's installed, and then prefabricated tunnel sections are set into the trench. And then there's backfill placed around the prefabricated sections after they've been sunk and joined together. So this process repeats itself until you have a completed tunnel that effectively lies below the seabed, but yet doesn't have to go down to the level of bedrock. It's an interesting way to build a tunnel, and it's a way that's typically done when bedrock is too deep to reach. And in this particular case, on the Gulf Coast, bedrock is less than a sure thing, to say the least. So to build a tunnel in this way was the most economic option. The Wallace Tunnels are named for Alabama's governor, George Wallace, who served 4 non-consecutive terms between the 1960s and 1980s. Wallace is perhaps most known for opposing desegregation and supporting the policies of Jim Crow during the Civil Rights Movement, declaring in his infamous 1963 inaugural address that he stood for segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. So this issue of Wallace's tenure as Alabama governor and his history as being pro-segregation and whatnot, it is sort of the basis for a larger discussion about the worthiness of his name being attached to something like this. And landmarks in our cities ought to honor the history and the values of the communities they serve. That's kind of the belief that I've always had. So when you look at everything, when you take it in its totality, this seems to be an example of a prominent infrastructure landmark in a major American city whose name is, to say the least, questionable. Now, there are those who will say that, Wallace reformed his points of view in his later years, and, he became a born-again Christian and all that. And all of that is true to some extent. He survived an assassination attempt in 1972, and that was, I think, a lot of the basis for how he moderated his points of view in later years. But we also have to take into account that the tunnels were named for Wallace when they opened in 1973. So they didn't have the later years to go on. They were going off of the 60s era George Wallace stuff, the pro-segregation stuff, when they named the tunnels for him. So the counter argument of taking in his entire life into account, that doesn't work here. They were taking into account the famous 1960s obstructionist George Wallace. That's where this becomes an issue for me. I think you can maybe there is some sort of an inroads here to make an argument. If they had named the tunnels in the 1990s for him, then maybe there's an argument there that you could make. But I don't think it's a sound argument when you factor in the timing of the naming into the equation. So I don't know what people think about that. Maybe there's, I'm not an Alabama resident. I never have been and likely never will be. So I'm not a local. I don't have this history in my blood like a lot of people do. I come at this as an outsider with an outside point of view. But I don't think it's unreasonable nor unfair for people to raise eyebrows at the fact that a major facility on Interstate 10, a transcontinental interstate, has this gentleman's name attached to it. I think that I'm not suggesting that it's right or wrong. I am suggesting that it is right to ask the question. And whatever the answer is that comes out of it, let the answer come out in the end after discussion. But I think it's fair to expect that there would be a discussion. Further east from the tunnels, we have the Mobile Bayway, which extends nearly 8 miles from the east end of the Wallace Tunnel to the east shore of Mobile Bay near Spanish Fort. The original causeway consists of twin spans, each carrying 2 lanes for traffic, built very much in the style of the long, elevated causeways found across southern Louisiana, for instance. If you've ever driven the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway outside of New Orleans, really I-10 west of New Orleans has a few lengthy structures like this, chief among them being the Atchafalaya Basin Bridge between Baton Rouge and Lafayette. It's a very Louisianan structure, and that's sort of what it reminds me of. The Bayway was completed to traffic in 1978 and functionally replaced the old surface causeway across Mobile Bay, which is still in use today and is known as Battleship Parkway. That parkway serves as the main line for U.S. routes 90 and 98 through the area to this day. Now, as I hinted at before, the Wallace Tunnels are considered functionally obsolete and are a traffic bottleneck point. Congestion forms pretty frequently at the tunnel entrances in either direction of I-10 at most hours of the day. Trucks carrying hazardous cargo are also banned from the tunnels downtown and must divert to the US 98 truck route instead. That creates a problem in terms of the operational effectiveness of the interstate through Mobile. The existing Bayway is also not built to withstand 100-year storm surge events in Mobile Bay. Remember how I said that this is hurricane country? Really, with the event known as Hurricane Katrina, greater attention has been paid in recent years to low-level bridges and their ability to withstand storm surge events. And so it's been known for a long time that the Bayway structures are functionally obsolete and in some respects structurally deficient. However, there is no danger to the traveling public. It's just that the existing structures are not sustainable in the long-term future. Nearly 100,000 vehicles a day utilize the Wallace Tunnels in the Bayway, which is nearly 3 times the number that these facilities were designed to handle back in the 1970s. So we've established the parameters of the existing Wallace Tunnels in Bayway and how they are inadequate for modern traffic in the 21st century. In fact, plans to replace the Bayway with a modern structure go as far back as 2001, when Alabama DOT made the first suggestions about studying the existing facility and looking for ways to improve I-10 across the Mobile area. It's taken about 20 years for the final plans to emerge, but at this point it appears that the direction that state, local, and federal officials are moving in is a complete replacement of the Bayway and the Wallace Tunnels with a new high-rise bridge over the Mobile River and a new and improved Bayway structure. The focal point of the new Bayway complex would be a high-rise cable stay span over the Mobile River, which would have a vertical clearance of 215 feet above river level. The high-rise bridge would carry 6 lanes of I-10. Remember that the existing tunnels carry a total of 4 lanes, 2 in each direction. The new bridge would carry 3 lanes per direction for a total of 6. The new Bayway causeways would carry 6 to 8 lanes of traffic, which would nearly double the existing capacity of the Bayway. The new Bayway would be built on a similar but not identical alignment, likely a more parallel alignment that would allow construction of the new structures to take place while maintaining full access to the existing structures and minimizing traffic disruption along the interstate during the construction process. So functionally, the new Mobile River Bridge would be a replacement of the Wallace Tunnels. However, in some recent simulations, and we'll look at one of these in a second, the existing Wallace Tunnels would be retained for local traffic. That I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense. I could see keeping the tunnels if you were going to build a smaller bridge, like if you were just going to build a 4-lane bridge, but it appears that they're going to completely divert the interstate over to the new bridge, so I'm not really sure what purpose the existing tunnels are serving if we have a new bridge in parallel. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and maybe that's going to be ironed out in the future, but the simulation we're about to watch features both bridge and tunnel. So you know what, let's do that now, alright? Before we go any further here. This is a simulation that was published on the Mobile River Bridge Project website, and this gives you a pretty good overview, I think, of the project as a whole, at least as far as the Central River Bridge project is concerned. So we're going to take a look at this now. This video starts on the west side of the river, south of downtown. So you can see on the left here you have the tunnel, the existing interstate, and on the right is the new high-rise bridge that will replace it functionally. And I have to say that, you know, the design of this is spectacular. I know some people are not really big fans of cable stay construction, that, you know, maybe it's not the most creative, maybe it's not the most beautiful, it can be a little bit cumbersome. cable stay bridges are everywhere nowadays in North America, but I would say that if this was the final design that was chosen, then this is pretty striking. And I'm a little bit biased too because I have experience in long span cable stay construction, but if Mobile had to settle for something like this, I think this is pretty spectacular, pretty amazing. Again, notice how high the roadway is. It's over 200 feet above the river, so the approaches to the high-rise structure are massive. I mean, they dwarf the approaches to the tunnel at both ends. As we reach the east end of the existing interstate, what continues up ahead is the Bayway. So the new Bayway structure would be, I would imagine, ultimately integrated into the existing high-rise bridge. And as you see, it's 6 lanes for the high-rise, and you still have the interchange with Battleship Parkway here that will be preserved. So your Bayway, as it heads east towards Spanish Fort, will be about 8 lanes wide, plus full shoulders. So it's a massive improvement in terms of capacity. As far as a structure that can be resilient to hurricanes and storm surges, I think that this is a win as well. So that's the basic idea. And a couple other things to note. Some of the ramps downtown will be removed and replaced with at-grade interchanges, to lessen the footprint of the highways on the city on the city grid. And then there's other considerations, reworking the interchange at the west end of the Bayway at the entrances to the tunnels. And then this is an overall shot, which looks at downtown, and you can see where the existing interstate is compared to where the new facilities are going to be. The new high-rise bridge is going to be located south or downriver of where the existing Wallace Tunnels are. So the interstate will be largely removed from the city center, which is another benefit, I think, to doing this project, is that it takes the interstate traffic away from the city, which I think can help development in that part of the downtown core for sure. So that's the walkthrough of what's going on here as far as what they would like to build. Now, there's always the question of how we pay for something like this. Alabama hopes to utilize the Federal Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, TIFIA, which offers low-interest loans to help pay for federal highway projects, and this project will likely be one of those. The state would like to finance 49% of the entire project through TIFIA loans. This is not unprecedented. When the Tappan Zee Bridge was replaced in New York State, TIFIA loans funded about 50% of that project. So it seems like what the state is looking for here is within reason, and it's within precedent as far as how much money they would be seeking from the federal government from low-interest loans. Alabama officials are also working out the logistics of a tolling plan that would also help fund the project. This plan establishes a $2.50 toll for a one-way trip over the new bridge, or a $40 monthly pass for unlimited trips via a new toll tag that Alabama plans to roll out, which has been provisionally named ALGO, A-L-G-O. There are sticking points in contention with the public over the proposed tolling idea. I mean, if you know what's going on in New York State right now over congestion pricing, you know that people do not like to pay tolls. And so you can imagine how popular the tolling idea has been at public hearings recently. So that's still something that's in limbo that has to be agreed upon and decided. So they're weighing that versus the fact that state officials want the project completed at once and as soon as possible. And they would like to complete the new high-rise bridge in conjunction with the Bayway instead of having this extended, phased construction over many years that would be piecemealed and would take place over more than a decade. They would rather complete this project in a 5 to 6 year time frame and get it all done at once. AlDOT is also on the record as wanting the project to be publicly owned and not open to a private ownership scenario, the latter of which has not been ruled out either. Private operation and maintenance of a completed project would be a way to offset costs, but it would also place the state in a relatively powerless position with an owner seeking to make profit off of its property in the long term. The dreaded idea of infrastructure for profit, which I have never been in favor of and I think is a terrible idea. When you put the public safety and interests against profit, to me that's a lethal combination that we really should not be trying to embrace here in this country. So where do we go from here? Well, the US DOT awarded a $550 million grant from the federal government to the Mobile River Bridge and Bayway project in July of 2024. The total project cost is currently estimated at $3.5 billion. Keep in mind that that figure is nearly double what it was about 10 years ago, and it will likely continue to go higher. It would, in any case, be the single largest and most monumental project in Alabama's history. Alabama officials are optimistic that the project can break ground in late 2025. It is unknown, however, whether the Francis Scott Key Bridge replacement in Baltimore, Maryland, a project that was thrust into the engineering and supply chain communities unexpectedly, will have any impact on this timeline. And on that note, it's worth mentioning that member firms of the joint venture negotiating with Alabama DOT to build the new Bayway project are the same firms who were recently awarded design and construction work on the Key Bridge in Maryland. So maybe meaningful construction starts late next year, late 2025. If I'm going to take a guess, and I don't like to take guesses on stuff like this, I think that this will be pushed back. By how much remains to be seen. But I don't see meaningful construction on the new Bayway starting in the year 2025. Optimistically, I would say 26. It wouldn't surprise me if this gets delayed and the can gets kicked down the road further. But the Bayway project as a whole would be an amazing, monumental undertaking for the Gulf Coast region, and I think it would be a great project to keep tabs on. Hell, it'd be a great project for someone like me to work on. And this is one that I will be paying attention to in the next few years once construction finally gets underway. So I hope you guys follow along with it too. Stay tuned. All right, so we've dealt with I-10. Let's deal quickly here with I-65. It's the main highway north to south in Alabama, connecting the state's largest cities, Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Huntsville. In the case of a hurricane evacuation, and this is something that is not unique to I-65, but this highway can be converted to an evacuation route where all lanes flow in the northbound direction. In the case of I-65 between Mobile and Montgomery. This concept is known as contraflow. So you can have, obviously the northbound lanes will carry northbound traffic, but the southbound lanes can be shut down and reversed so that you can have northbounders on that side of the road as well. We see this in other cases in the Gulf Coast region, such as I-59 heading north through Mississippi, and I-55 as well, heading out of Louisiana into Mississippi. Similar concept, where both of those highways are also capable of contraflow operation. I don't know about I-75 in Georgia, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's another one. I think I-16 in Georgia is another example where that's been used in the past. So, not too uncommon. You know, in this part of the country, it's something that's a good idea to have in case of emergency situations. Again, more slots in the signs here. These are, again, older generation signs that Alabama was using that are being phased out. In the Mobile area, I-65 is really not anything too exciting to write home about, with the exception of the stretch that spans the Mobile-Tensaw Delta north of town. This section opened in 1981. It was one of the final segments of I-65 to be built, in fact, between Alabama and Indiana. The twin-span causeway that spans the delta is about 6 miles long. It features a dual-span high-level arch bridge over the Mobile River Navigation Channel, which is what you see pictured here. Mobile has a single auxiliary interstate, and it's I-165, which is built to connect downtown Mobile with I-65 north of town. However, that's not exactly the original intent of the highway. It was originally planned and numbered as Interstate 210 because it was going to connect to I-10 at its southern end. The original plan called for an elevated freeway along Water Street that would have connected the north end of what's currently the freeway in North Mobile with the three-way interchange with I-10 at the western entrance to the Wallace Tunnel. Various problems arose during the 1970s and 80s during the planning process. Community opposition and questions over access to the Mobile waterfront with the construction of the freeway being in place. All of this prevented the freeway from reaching its intended southern terminus at I-10. So I-65 ends about 1 mile short of I-10 to the north and transitions seamlessly into Water Street, which in the end was expanded into a large, divided highway arterial with a landscaped median. And it more or less serves the same purpose that the elevated freeway would have served anyway. It's just that now all of this traffic is at grade instead of on a towering elevated structure through the middle of the city. So since the original plan to connect the highway with I-10 failed, it no longer was going to reach I-10, the interstate was renumbered as a spur, and it became known as I-165 instead. The entire length of I-165 is elevated. It's about 5 miles long. It runs from North Mobile through the Africatown neighborhood of the north side of Mobile and Pritchard, through what used to be the central business district of Pritchard. Its construction in the early 1990s resulted in the demolition of many structures within the central business district of downtown Pritchard, including such landmarks as the main public library and the fire station. So here's a look at Water Street, before we move on, and this sort of illustrates what I mean. It's a 4 to 6 lane surface boulevard with traffic lights at grade intersections. There's not a ton of traffic that's transiting this from end to end, so it's adequate to handle the amount of traffic that it serves. I don't know that an elevated interstate through this area would have served this traffic any better. I think that what they ended up doing here was the correct decision. All right, so that's it for the major roads. Now, before we go, we have crossings of Mobile Bay and the Mobile River to discuss. So let's do that, shall we? There's a few of these I want to point out to you before we end this program. We're going to start way outside the city, out in Mobile Bay, with the Dauphin Island Causeway, which is Alabama Highway 193. This connects the mainland south of Mobile with Dauphin Island on the west side of Mobile Bay. The causeway is formally named for Seth Gordon Persons, who served as the 43rd governor of Alabama from 1951 to 1955. The bridge, this iteration of the bridge, was completed in 1982, and it replaced a prior bridge built in 1955 that was destroyed by Hurricane Frederick in 1979. At the south end of the bridge, you can also pick up the Mobile Bay Ferry, which connects Dauphin Island on the west side of Mobile Bay with Fort Morgan and Gulf Shores on the east side of the bay. Year-round ferry service is provided, and there is, of course, additional service during the busy summer months. Moving into town once again, we've already discussed the George Wallace Tunnel at length on I-10, so we'll skip that, and we'll talk instead about the Bankhead Tunnel, which is nearby the Wallace Tunnel. It carries the main line of U.S. Highway 98 It was built from 1938 to 1941, and this is another example of immersed tunnel construction. There's a 12-foot height clearance maximum in the tunnel, so large vehicles such as trucks and also hazardous materials are not permitted in the Bankhead Tunnel, which is why there's a US 98 truck route that crosses around the north side of town and crosses on the Africatown Bridge before reuniting with I-10 and Battleship Parkway at the east end of the tunnel. The eastern end of the Bankhead Tunnel features a large floodgate that can be closed across the portal to prevent water from Mobile Bay flooding the tunnel during surges from hurricanes or tropical storms. The Bankhead Tunnel is named for John Hollis Bankhead, who served as U.S. Senator from the state of Alabama from 1907 until his death in 1920. Bankhead had additionally served previously in the United States House of Representatives and the Alabama State Legislature. And prior to his career in politics, he served in the Confederate States Army during the Civil War, rising to the rank of captain in the Alabama 16th Infantry Regiment. So we were talking earlier about problematic names, with George Wallace, with the Confederate heritage here. Is this another example of a problematic name? I'm not here to answer that question definitively. I didn't name the tunnel this, and as I said, I look at this from an outsider's point of view. So I don't know how people feel about this, but an argument I suppose could be made one way or the other, and I invite you guys to have that discussion amongst yourselves in a civil and respectful manner, please. That's always what we prefer. So I'm just here to tell you the reality, and you guys can come to your own conclusions about what you think. Last but not least, we have the Cochrane Africatown USA Bridge, which is on the north side of town. This bridge opened in 1991. It was the first cable-stay bridge built in the state of Alabama. It carries the main line of US Route 90 and also carries the US 98 truck route that I alluded to before, that kind of loops around the north side of town to bypass the Bankhead Tunnel and also the George Wallace Tunnel. Remember that heavy trucks and oversized vehicles and hazardous materials have only one way to get around Mobile at this point, and that is to use the Africatown Bridge, as the tunnels are off limits to hazardous materials and those sorts of vehicles, as I alluded to before. Now, before we discuss and dissect the name of this bridge, because it is a pretty important feature, we do have to spend a second on what was the most dramatic chapter in this bridge's history. It took place in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in August 2005, when an oil rig platform moored in the Mobile River broke free from its moorings during the storm and became wedged underneath the bridge's roadway. And this dramatic photo was taken in the days after the storm. The rig was able to be freed from its position, and the bridge only sustained minor damage, fortunately, and it was allowed to remain open while repairs were made. But this is one of the lasting images of Hurricane Katrina's devastation in the Gulf Coast. Not a whole lot gets talked about as far as its impacts to Mississippi and Alabama, because obviously that storm is remembered for the destruction that it brought to New Orleans. But certainly images like this were commonplace all along the Gulf Coast within that storm's reach. So quite an interesting and unique image here that came out of that storm here in Mobile. Apart from the wild history of the oil rig after Hurricane Katrina, this bridge has had a pretty quiet and uneventful lifespan. As I said, it's been around for about 30 years or so. Still is the only cable-stay bridge in the state of Alabama, although that very well could change should the Mobile River project get underway in the near future. So we would interestingly have multiple cable-stay bridges in the state, both of which within ice shot of each other. The Africatown neighborhood was established after the Civil War in 1868 on the north side of Mobile. The founders of the neighborhood were among the survivors of the Clotilda, the last slave ship known to have brought captured Africans to America. At least 12 million Africans were shipped to the Americas in the 350 years of the transatlantic slave trade. The very last of these men, women, and children, 110 in all, arrived in Mobile Bay aboard the Clotilda in July 1860. The Clotilda was a two-masted schooner built in 1855 and measuring 86 feet long with a beam of 23 feet. On this voyage, the ship was captained by William Foster, working on behalf of Timothy Mayer, a wealthy Mobile shipyard owner and steamboat captain. Although designed for the lumber trade, the Clotilda had been refitted for a second purpose as an illegal slave ship, containing a false deck and a hidden hold for smuggling illegal cargo. It was an example of illegal immigration before the term illegal immigration had been thought of or had any meaning in the average American household. Slavery was still legal in the southern states at the time, but the slave trade had been outlawed since 1808. The Clotilda's crew disembarked the 110 captured slaves, who had survived the voyage under horrendous conditions for about 7 weeks, under cover of darkness to avoid being caught themselves. Captain Foster then sailed the ship upriver, and in an effort to hide the evidence of the voyage, he and his crew burned and sank the ship in the Mobile River, a few miles north of downtown Mobile. It was a concerted effort undertaken by multiple parties to perform and then conceal crimes against humanity during a time when African Americans were still seen as 3/5 of a person. The exact whereabouts of the wreck remained a mystery until it was finally discovered in 2018 by a team of local researchers and reporters. The exact location of the wreck has not been made public out of fear that the site might attract vandals or treasure hunters. It's believed that even after 160 years underwater, the wreck might still contain human remains in the form of DNA, hair samples, even nail and tooth fragments, all of which could be used to identify additional descendants from the ship's passage. As a neighborhood, Africatown flourished during the early 20th century. At its peak in the 1960s, over 12,000 people lived here. The population has dwindled to fewer than 1,000 people in the decades since. The construction of the Africatown Bridge and the completion of Interstate 165 in the 1990s bisected the historic footprint of the neighborhood, but some of the neighborhood's old landmarks remain to this day. For example, the Africatown Cemetery contains the final resting place for some of the Clotilda's survivors, as well as generations of their descendants. The discovery of the Clotilda has led to new interest in revitalizing the neighborhood. The state of Alabama has since set aside $1 million for further study and excavation of the ship's wreck site. An expedition in 2022 returned to the wreck site, salvaging dozens of pieces of the Clotilda for forensic examination. In an effort to attract tourism to Africatown, about $10 million in city, state, local, federal, and philanthropic funds have gone towards the revitalization of the neighborhood. The most visible addition to the neighborhood during this period is a new visitor center, the Africatown Heritage House, which opened in 2023. The museum features an exhibit on the Clotilda and features extensive artifacts from the ship that have been recovered since the wreck's discovery in 2018. The story of the Clotilda has been passed down through the generations, and some of the descendants of those survivors continue to live in the Africatown neighborhood to this day. Just a few miles from where they first set foot in the Americas, and where the Clotilda's wreck currently still lies. They hope that increased awareness of their story will lead to greater interest in restoring and rebuilding this historic black community. And it's those descendants who helped make me aware of a story I never knew anything about until relatively recently. Thank you to you all. And with that, I'd like to close this episode by saying thanks for watching. Check out the Alabama Highways playlist if you would like to see more video content. from around the Gulf Coast region of Alabama or the state in general. There's footage from all across the state. There's also 4K videos that I rolled out in 2024 featuring the Mobile area as well. So you have your choice of content if you would like to see more. I think there are also other webinars out there that I've done and from the state of Alabama, and also there's the webinars playlist as well if you'd like to catch up on anything you might have missed. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have, why not help out the channel by liking the video and commenting below, and also hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. If you have a question or a comment about today's presentation, feel free to drop it in the comments below and keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.